Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a massive story, how British rule completely rewired India's economy, and in the process, took one of the world's richest nations and turned its fortunes upside down.
Okay, to really get a grip on this, you have to picture the world back in the early 1700s. India wasn't just a player on the world stage, it was an absolute giant. I mean, think about this. It accounted for almost a quarter of the entire global economy. 23%. That is just huge.
Now let's jump forward about 2 centuries to 1947 when India finally gains its independence. That massive 23%, it's gone. It is absolutely cratered all the way down to a tiny 3%.
So, you have to ask, right? What on earth happened? How does a nation's wealth just disappear like that? It's an incredible and pretty tough story. So, let's get right into it. All right, first up, let's talk about how they dismantled India's industry. And we're not talking about just any industry. We're talking about the things India was famous for all over the world. Its incredible artisans and those amazing world-class textiles. So you've got this massive mismatch, right? It's kind of like a high-tech factory going up against a master craftsman. On one side, you have Indian artisans using these incredible traditional techniques passed down through generations. But on the other, you have Britain's Industrial Revolution, with steam-powered machines just pumping out goods, way cheaper and way faster. It wasn't just a competition, it was a total collision.
But here's the thing, this wasn't some kind of natural free market competition. Oh no, it was all about deliberate policy. You see, after 1813, Britain kicked off this one-way free trade thing. What did that mean? Well, cheap British goods flooded into India, no problem. But if an Indian craftsman wanted to sell their amazing textiles in Britain, bam, they got hit with these super high taxes. It basically locked them out. And that's not all. The old Indian rulers who used to support these artisans were gone, and the new railways, well, they were like a super highway for British goods, pushing them into every corner of the country. The deck was completely stacked.
So what's the end result of all this? Well, historians have a name for it: deindustrialization. But that's a pretty academic term for something absolutely devastating. We're talking about millions of people, weavers, craftsmen, artisans, families who had been doing this for generations, just wiped out. Their livelihoods were gone. They were forced out of the only work they'd ever known.
Okay, so with industry collapsing, where do all these people go? You can't just have millions of newly unemployed people with nowhere to turn. This is where the story takes its next turn, and it's a big one. It's all about how the countryside itself was completely reshaped.
So with their old jobs gone, millions of people flooded into agriculture. It was really the only option they had left. But this created this huge overcrowding on the land, and right at that same moment, the British administration slaps these incredibly heavy, rigid land taxes on everyone. And get this, you had to pay in cash, right on time, even if you had a terrible harvest. So what happens? Peasants have to borrow money just to pay the tax man. They get trapped in this terrible cycle of debt, and more often than not, they end up losing the very land they're farming.
And this chart here really just says it all, doesn't it? Look at how that pie is divided. First, the government takes its huge slice. Then the landlord takes their cut. Then you've got a whole chain of middlemen, and then the moneylender. And that tiny, tiny little sliver left over at the end, that's what the actual farmer, the person doing all the work, gets to keep. It's next to nothing. This whole mess created this bizarre and honestly parasitic system. The term for it is sub-infeudation, which sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. The main landlord would rent out his right to collect rent to someone else, and then that person would rent it out again, and so on and so on. You end up with this long chain of people all taking a piece of the pie, but none of them actually doing anything to improve the land or help grow the crops. They were just middlemen profiting off the farmer's labor.
So you've got this 1-2 punch, right? First, you destroy the industries, then you squeeze the life out of agriculture. And when you put those two things together, well, the human consequences were just unimaginable. We're talking about poverty on a scale that's hard to fathom, and something even worse: famine. Just look at this timeline. It's brutal. The numbers are staggering. The Orissa famine, 2 million dead. The Great Famine, over 5 million. And between 1850 and 1900 alone, the total estimate is something like 28 million people died from famine. These weren't just one-off tragedies. This was a pattern.
And here's a really crucial point from Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. He argued that these weren't famines because there was no food. The food was often there. The problem was that people couldn't get to it.
In fact, records show that food was often being exported out of these exact regions while people were starving, all because it was more profitable. It was a failure of policy, a failure of distribution, not just a failure of crops. Okay, so a fair question to ask is, if the old industries were gone, did a new modern industrial India rise up to take its place? Did anything positive come out of this? Well, the answer is kind of complicated. It's a yes and a no. This table gives you a really clear picture of what that new industry looked like. And you can see right away, it's totally lopsided. Sure, you had Indian entrepreneurs building up a really impressive cotton textile industry, especially in places like Mumbai and Ahmedabad. But look at the other big sectors. Jute, coal, tea. They were almost completely dominated by British companies and British money. And the most important part? Heavy industry. Things like steel, machinery, the stuff you need to build a truly modern economy, almost non-existent. And again, this was not an accident. It wasn't just a quirk of the market. The growth was stunted on purpose. Colonial policies were designed to favor British manufacturers. There was no protection for new Indian industries trying to get started. Even the railway freight rates were rigged to make it cheaper to ship imported goods than Indian-made ones. Indian businessmen couldn't get loans. The whole system was built to keep India's industrial growth in check. But even with all these limits, this little bit of industrialization did something huge. It created two brand new social classes that had never really existed in India before. A small class of Indian industrial capitalists, the factory owners, and a modern working class, the people who worked in those factories. And these two groups would go on to change the course of Indian history. So let's just recap. India's economy was completely re-engineered. Its world-class industries were dismantled. Its agriculture was turned into a machine for extracting wealth. A new, limited industrial base was allowed to grow, but only in ways that served British interests. This whole process created a new India for sure, but it was built on a foundation of poverty and famine. Which leaves us with one last really important thought to chew on. Who, in the end, really paid the price for all of this?